So excited to have you here.
Right.
We're going to jump into things because we know your time is super valuable and we don't want to miss out the opportunity of asking you all the things that we want to ask. So we want to start with the first week of May is the National Week of Action for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, which DJ and I have been talking over text and in the last call that we were on around how it feels like the calls to justice have gone largely ignored. We don't hear about them often. I feel like the Truth and Reconciliation Report is finally something most Canadians are now aware of because of what happened last year in Kamloops, BC. But it still feels like the calls to justice and the national inquiry that went into it are largely unknown. And I feel like that's also been reflected in policies because we're not really seeing a lot of action on these calls to justice or the Truth and Reconciliation Report, to be honest, but at least people know about it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we know that, the budget just came out. We talk about, most people don't know about it. I would say that this has been a long-standing issue. Certainly, we had the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls that started in 2015 that came out with 231 calls for justice, a very clear calls to justice, something that was noted as a genocide by the current Prime Minister, acknowledged as a genocide, to once again come to this budget to find out that this government has provided $0 zero funding to address this ongoing genocide. And I have to say that when I found out the number was $0, not even $5, not even a treaty payment that hasn't gone up with inflation on the prairies, $0. The first thing that came to my mind is that we are not $0. My nieces are not $0. My mother, my grandmother, my sisters, my aunties are not $0. All the young people in my riding who have lost their lives are not $0. Tina Fontaine, 2 blocks from my house, a victim of the child welfare system, a young Indigenous girl who fell through the cracks and lost her life because of a failure of systems to respond adequately. Aisha Hudson shot by the Winnipeg City Police, 17, in the city of Winnipeg. That this is a genocide, and we can have a week of action, but when are people going to start listening? There's a normalization of violence against Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit in this country to the point where people find it acceptable. People in positions of political power find it acceptable. They accept it will go unnoticed if they provide $0 funding. We need to change that. That is willful and intentional ignoring of something that costs lives across this place. Now, people now call Canada every day. So on that week, I'll certainly be acting as I do every day, because if we don't act, it costs lives. And, I'm hoping to address this in the upcoming session in Parliament.
And so just thank you, first of all, thank you so much for sharing and for being with us and for naming those things. Just for folks for context, the calls for justice and the 93 calls for action are 2 completely different things, correct?
Yes. So the TRC report came out in 2015, and it provided calls to justice, or sorry, calls to action. 94 calls to action, 16 of which included implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In 2015, they started the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls in response to survivors of violence, families of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, advocacy groups from across the country, frontline advocates, calling for a national inquiry to this ongoing genocide. The National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls was released in 2019. 3 years, it's been 3 years since almost 3 years since the inquiry was released. We still see no action plan put in place to how to implement the 231 calls for justice that came out of the inquiry, including 4.5, to fully implement a guaranteed livable basic income, because we know there's a direct correlation between poverty and heightened rates of violence. And in this budget, once again, zero funding, in additional funding provided to deal with this ongoing genocide. To me, that's violence. To me, that's violence when you turn a blind eye to violence. That's an act of violence. So the government's failure to address this, in my view, at this point, is an act of violence. We must not stay silent about this violence.
And
so, sorry, I was going to say, so I think Selena in the chat, who's also been on our live, is saying it's that zero funding is willful and intentional, and I feel like that's a really accurate and concise way of saying, like, you don't forget about this. It's a choice. You've chosen not to allocate money there, and that seems consistent with how the government has been handling anything related to Indigenous folk, both currently and historically, because if there's no action plan, there's no money. If there's no money, nothing's going to change, and they're not putting any effort behind it. And it feels like, what is, like, has anything changed? Like, what can we do to?
Well, yeah. Well, I believe in the movement. Like, I always say in interviews, certainly since being elected, like, I was supported by the movement, I was funded by the movement, I was elected by the movement. I get ongoing support, from the movement. People are powerful. I think they're more powerful than elected officials, because we're always one vote away to losing our jobs. I mean, that's our jobs. The power is with the people. I know through other efforts, whether it's been fighting to see the full implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, for example, that it wasn't government goodwill that actually passed it. It was people power. It was a movement that was spread across the country, pushing the government to finally see the adoption and full implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, something that already had application in Canadian law, in fact. Since 2007, Bill C-15 that was passed, which saw the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, merely affirmed its application in Canadian law, even though it had an application prior. And that came from people. That came from people. We have seen civil rights movements in the States. That was not because of elected people's goodwill. That was because of a people's movement. We now have the climate, although, not acting sufficiently or adequately to the urgency it demands, we now know that the climate emergency needs to be front and center. And that is not because of big corporations and governments that fund and fuel much political activity in this country. That was because of people in the movement, particularly young people. So I think our collective action to say we do not accept zero funding, we will not stop until this genocide is being dealt with so that Indigenous women, girls, divert and 2S can live freely without the threat of violence, that's when things change. And if people in power know that their action or inaction will cost them their power, you bet they'll respond.
And so I know that you've been advocating heavily for, advocating heavily for livable income through your bill. I think it's C223.
Yes.
And as one of the solutions to dealing with one of these, to this genocide, what are some? I would love for you to expand on Bill C223, but I'd also love to know what are some other recommendations that came from those? Like, what other calls to justice were kind of clearly named in that report?
Well, certainly, I mean, there were several, and they related to different areas. One certainly was with policing, the RCMP, for example, who we know have been directly implicated in violence against Indigenous women and girls. One of the examples that I give quite frequently, it's a very current example, was the 2 women in Wet'suwet'en Territory that had their door taken down with an axe and a chainsaw and an attack dog, two unarmed women living out their existence, living out their inherent rights on their ancestral lands. And then we saw the illegal occupation of Ottawa that took place over a month, a place that I had to work in. It was not peaceful, where police literally turned a blind eye. So a direct correlation between police involvement in violence, but also inaction to the violence. Certainly housing, relationships with housing, that's another critical area. And connections with systemic racism. We saw the example of Joyce Echequan, who died in the hospital, pleading for help. So it spans all different systems, certainly a path forward. Now it's time for the government to do what they need to do to act to mitigate this ongoing genocide. They choose not to. I'll give you how much money. I mean, I know it's not just money. People say, well, it's not just money. They're right. It's not just money. The community has the answers. Okay, it's not just money. We've provided a set of calls for justice. Absolutely, it's not. Somebody said education, health, justice. Absolutely, it's not just money. But here you have a government who gives how many billions of dollars to fossil fuel industries? They're now buying F-35 fighter jets. Okay, that are used to end life. That are riddled with errors. We've increased the military budget. Just an example, bailed out corporations. Billionaires have made more than ever, and we can't even get $5. So that's an issue. And I mean, whether it's education, child welfare, policing, housing, income, those are paths forward. At least an olive branch would be to tackle at least one of those areas.
Mm-hmm.
And when we look, so the budget's been presented, but it hasn't passed yet. So is there time for does the public get to get feedback? What can I do as someone who doesn't sit in the House but cares deeply about these issues? How do I participate? Because I feel like we keep seeing, like, there's obvious, like, I don't know where, I don't understand money, but there's money for a lot of other things that I don't have any interest in. That
Can you give me an example? Just kidding. There's so many examples.
There's so many examples.
What do you mean?
I feel like there's money, emergency money that we're using to support what's going on in Ukraine. Interestingly enough, not doing anything to really help people in Palestine, but that's neither here nor there. How do we like there's money that like that money came out of somewhere and we're sending that now. So like where is that, like what are we doing here in Canada to take care of our own people? Like I feel like we have this like moral superiority as Canadians while failing the people in our own country. So what can
Well,
I do?
yeah, well, I think, like I said, write your MPs, write your senators. If there's one specific area that you want to see shift, if you want to see an area shift, it takes a lot of work. I've had the honor. I just turned 50 on April the 8th, and
Yes, Aries, happy birthday.
I know.
Happy birthday.
It's all about Aries. I'm just saying.
I'm just saying as well.
I'm an Aquarius. Let me be included.
Yes. But, it takes work and it takes movement and it takes voice. I think sometimes people forget how powerful they are as individual people. Like they center power around title. But I disagree with that. People, you're given power by people. Your power and privilege and voice is fueled by the people. And so I actually see my voice as weaker. So if you see your voice as part of change, because it is, all of our voices are part of change, then you use that voice. And some people use it differently than others. Like some people are on the front, and then some people are artists, painting pictures, or writers, or musicians, or they're thinkers and learners, and they learn about justice and they change action. Just act.
I think one thing that I've come to learn along kind of my journey in this work is that we need to redefine what civic engagement looks like, particularly for this generation who's lost trust in the system and who doesn't necessarily see itself engaging with it in the traditional way. So, while we don't necessarily see ourselves connected to political institutions, this generation, as you mentioned before, is on the front lines of every single major political movement or social uprising that we've witnessed. We're on social media creating media campaigns. We are getting involved in our community organizations. We are artists. We are, singers, you name it. And so I think for me, what I try to encourage people to do as much as possible is to obviously engage with the systems in formal ways by voting and writing to their MPs. But even if that feels so far or too far away, then to find the ways and the networks and the circles of influence in which you can change things.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah.
I was going to say yes. And it just like people, yes, we should engage. Yes, we have to do more. Yes, we've got to like hold our leaders accountable and advocate on things. But like the world is really chaotic and it's their full-time job to represent people and take care of this country. So sometimes it's really frustrating to be like when the onus is put on people because like I'm fucking tired. Like and like it just feels
I'm tired. I'm 50. I'm real tired. So tired.
We just turned 30 and we're like, it's over.
It's over. My whole life. Yeah. But it feels frustrating that like what is the like I know people have power, but it only works when we all come together, because like what can one person really do when they're emailing an MP that's not getting back to them or tweeting at a leader?
So like look, it is a lot of work. I'm not saying that's one action of several actions you can do when you talk about writing MPs and stuff. I mean, that's one action. There's all sorts of actions you can do. But it is a lot of work. Like I often tell this story. I actually told it at the Broadbent Institute. I was 40, lying in my bed. I'm exhausted. I'm a full-time academic. I'm a single parent. And I'm working till sometimes 2, 3 in the morning on the movement. So I work a full-time job and I volunteer fighting for the world till 2 in the morning every day. And one day I'm just exhausted, right? Because I always did it, you see, because of my family history. Like my mom grew up in child welfare, aged out of care when she was 18, March, you're on your own. My dad was the only surviving child after the Holocaust. So I come from genocides from different parts of the world. And when you come from genocides from different parts of the world, it's an intense experience. And I think the way my parents handled it was through activism, fighting for a better world. That's how they survived their trauma from their experiences. And there was never a time when I wasn't fighting. Like, I remember being 4 years old and folding pamphlets during an election campaign. You know, I have memories as a fetus. I'm just kidding. But I'm sure they were campaigning or doing some activism while I was even ingested as a fetus. I mean, there was never a time where I wasn't involved. 40 years old.
Knocking doors. You were hearing the door.
Knocking doors. I was hearing doors. What's that? What's that? You know, oh, it's my future. But you know, I'm like exhausted, and I'm like, why am I doing this? Like, I'm exhausted, and I'm like burnt out, and I just like, I don't even know why I do this, because I was born into it. Like, this wasn't true. You just do this. And then it came to me, like, I'm 40 years old, and I'm like, wow, I'm fighting for the right to joy. I'm fighting for the right to joy for myself, my son, my family, for my community, for the world. Because when you come from oppression, everything has been put in our place to strip away our joy. And when you violate people's human rights, you strip them of their joy. So living joy is actually a revolutionary act. And so that's the guiding principle, is that in your advocacy and your work, you can't lose sight of the joy, because then what are you fighting for? Then you're just fighting. You know, you can't lose sight of the joy. Like, even if it's like, if you are fighting against the climate crisis, well, what's the end game? A beautiful river, a flourishing garden, a beautiful tree, animal life, flowers. That's joyful. So always keeping sight of that joy in the struggle. And it kind of makes it a bit better, even though I'm not going to lie, I'm tired.
I was listening to a podcast the other day with Brene Brown, and I don't know who the other amazing guest was, but the guest's book was all around essentially centering moments of joy and beauty as the main work, and activism as something that she does on the side. So she was saying that, you know, a lot of people do wait to be exhausted and completely depleted to then be like, oh, must find moments of joy, must find moments of rest. Whereas what she was saying is that if you are intentional about finding moments of beauty and joy every day, then it allows you, and it serves as fuel for this work that can be depleting. And so you're not running on an empty gas, essentially on an empty tank, kind of constantly refueling yourself, because it needs to be sustainable and for the long haul.
Yeah. So I exercise regularly. I cook. I like cooking a lot. I try and participate in things that give me joy. I have a lot of alone time. I like writing a lot. And yeah, gotta have that joy, you know? Gotta have that joy.
Mindful of time, and Sam, I don't know if you want to say something, but I would have loved for you to expand on Bill C-223 and what that is and why you're doing it and how we can support.
Sure. It's Bill C-223 is in support of developing a framework for a guaranteed livable basic income, and it's for anybody over the age of 18, not requiring participation in work or employment for students, seniors, temporary foreign workers, permanent residents, refugee claimants who currently do not have a livable income. So, and we have income guarantees in the country, but they're not livable. I'm going to give you some examples. Social assistance, or what they call in Manitoba, EIA, not livable. It's guaranteed, not livable. GIS for seniors, guaranteed income supplement, another income guarantee. Again, guaranteed, not livable. All I'm asking for is to take our income guarantees, make them livable, and expand them out. And part of that comes into, for specifically in response to Call to Justice 4.5 of the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, but also my call to re-understanding notions of work that fall outside of neoliberal systems, often performed by women. Unpaid care work, mostly
Childcare.
by women. Yeah, childcare. I was a early childhood educator, not livable. Or a couple of examples. People with complex mental health and trauma that might, you know, be able to work 2 days really well, but maybe can't hold down a 5-day job, but really like working, should still have a right to live in dignity, or the 70% of adults with severe intellectual disabilities that live in poverty, or seniors, particularly women, who performed unpaid care work and have no pension for it, and who looked after, worked their whole life, raising their families, caring for others, now living in poverty because they have no pension. So that's my bill. In the last Parliament, I put forward motion 46 in support of a guaranteed livable basic income. It had over 50,000 signatures. The petition, I decided to put it forward as a bill in this session. And, you know, let's keep fighting. You know, artists gutted during the pandemic. For me, I think art is an essential service. Like, can you imagine the pandemic without books, movies, poetry, music?
100%.
It kept my spirit alive. Talk about joy.
And I think Sweden was the first country to actually implement a $2,000 UBI for their artists specifically.
Yeah.
Wow.
Post-pandemic.
Yeah. Can you imagine the world without art? What a sad world. Take away my joy. Nobody's taking away my joy. Fighting for my right to joy. Guaranteed livable basic income for artists, please.
So is it, if I understand correctly, it's not necessarily, it's a form of UBI for particular industries or sectors that cannot
it's an unconditional payment for anybody who currently does not have a livable income. Like, I have a livable income, so I wouldn't qualify.
Got it.
It's
so anybody can apply for this.
So
if you does not have a livable wage.
So if you were working part-time, but it wasn't a livable wage, you would get that supplemented, a top-up.
A top-up.
That's amazing. We should do that.
That's amazing.
We should totally do that. How do we make that happen? That's amazing. The fact that we are this wealthy of a nation and that we don't have livable, that are existing, like for folks with disabilities and elderly folk and everything, like the fact that it's not a livable wage is bullshit. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, exactly. Or migrant workers who literally were stuck in a shoebox being fed food rations should not have to be there, because not putting up with an employer who's violating their human rights means that they'll starve to death. Like, let's get real. It's time for a guaranteed livable basic income.
I'm into it.
This was a blast. I want to do this all the time. You have so many followers. I want to be you. You have like 1 million followers.
We want to be you.
No, you.
Come back whenever. Open door, open invite. Come back whenever.
Yeah, you invite me. I'll be here for sure. That was great.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for changing the world. This is action. What you're doing, you're saying, like, I'm so tired. This is changing the world.
I hope
It's our
so.
way. It's when this is our lazy way. We're like, let's just get on Instagram.
This is action. Just act. Just act. Done. Change the world. Let's do it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And have a lovely rest of your day.
You too. You
Thank
too.
you. Thank you for your work.
Bye.
Oh yeah. Thank you for your work. Bye-bye.